Hi, everyone. I think you know who I am by now. Dr. Heather Boynton, and board member of the Canadian Society for Spirituality and Social Work. I got a Taylor Institute grant to look at spiritual pedagogy. It's a 3-year grant. We're in our final wrap-up right now. We did a bunch of different things during the grant, which we'll talk about. But Sarah is a PhD student with me, and she's my research coordinator, and she does a fabulous job with this research team that we have. We have a great group of students and volunteers who are just so amazing and keen, and so they've done a lot of this work. And we'll present on some of our findings around how spirituality is experienced by students, because we did an evaluation of a course, and then also what we found in literature and focus groups. So.
Yeah. And Marigold is one of the researchers on this team, but she lives in Ghana, and she has facilitated and connected us with the University of Ghana, so some of our research is from students that are in the social work program in there. So we'll just quickly go through today our team, our research aims, the questions we used, our methodology, the gaps that we found that our research is addressing, and then what our findings are. So the other people on our research team are Dr. Christine Walsh and Julie Jolet, researchers Ingrid Sinclair and Ibrahim Fayez, and Fiona Edwards and Julie Mann Johnson.
Yeah, so the aim of our research was really to look at how do we go about spiritual pedagogy? What do students experience? And we really wanted to elevate their voices in what they found effective in helping them learn and helping them in their own spiritual development and worldview. We also took a deep dive into the literature. We wanted to see, was there anything on competencies out there? And in what professions, and how could we learn from that, and how can we build upon that? And some of the work I had already done on spiritual competencies, we applied to this. I have actually an article that's been 2 years in review because they can't find someone who feels they're competent enough to review the article. So I'm still waiting for that, but it's been reviewed by one person. So we're waiting for the second one. So that competency framework has been applied to the course as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we read those. Basically, we had a hunch that there were gaps in understanding how students are, or if and to what extent they're getting any spirituality related content in their course, and especially in social work, that's something we know is important, but we're finding already that it's not being provided pedagogically to students. And one of the biggest reasons is because a lot of professors don't know how they can do such a thing if they even want to. So the most of the literature does show that it's from a faculty perspectives voice, and they're saying we don't really know what we're allowed to or what we should provide in terms of spirituality content. And so we knew that, but what we wanted to do was the dive to expand on that and understand really what can our research provide more of an understanding on. And so we found these aspects. There was limited student voices, so mostly it's all faculty's perspectives. Not enough data on the competencies that they are developing spiritual-wise in their practices. Little theory on spirituality even in the course content. A big one for students is ethical ambiguities. Like I said, how much are we allowed to share about our spiritualities or work with other clients in a spiritual context, and ethical tensions that brings up, and then very few studies assessing what tools students we want them to be developing. So our methodology was a qualitative design. So we did the literature review I described and a narrative synthesis of that using confidence. Our sample was 18 social work students, 13 in the University of Ghana, and 5 at the University of Calgary, plus 8 other students' course materials that they used. So we had discussion board posts, which were pretty intimate discussions about their learning and their development. So we were able to see a lot of this developmental arc of how they are processing their learning. And we collected focus groups and course evaluations along with the discussion board posts and their digital story assignments. We analyzed it using Braun and Clark's thematic analysis and to identify themes. And then Heather's framework.
And just outside of this, we also did a annotated bibliography, which is available on the Transforming Field Education and Learning website, so that we wanted to see what was out there. So that's available to anyone online. And we are in the process of a manuscript on that as well.
Okay.
Okay. So findings really revealed what students found were impactful. What things came up for them? How did they move through some things? Many students found it a discomforting process to look at their own spirituality and their own spiritual worldview, and how it was influenced and how they came to have that spiritual worldview, and then how does it intersect in their work, and how might it create biases and judgments. But they also said it was very powerful. A lot of the reflective experiences that they went through were part of this sort of evolving nature of their developing competence, or what I like to say, spiritual humility. You know, we talk about cultural humility, but we also need to have spiritual humility. And they really helped us to look at the framework that I had developed. And it was actually fascinating to see what in my brain, and from what I'd seen in the literature, what I thought the competencies should be and how they should be mapped out, and then how students experience that. So that was really, really interesting. And then also how they felt going into field, right? Pretty well all the students said they felt much more confident, more ready for practice and what might crop up for them.
So we have a couple themes that we've organized our findings into. So reflection on the pedagogical strategies. So we identified that most researchers have few findings for that. One of the quotes was, "I would have loved more simulation exercises. I tried to incorporate spirituality in my assessment and it was really scary." So there are assessment tools for using spirituality with your clients, but not being taught to social workers enough, social work students.
Yeah. So one of their assignments was actually they had to do a spiritual assessment with someone, and then get comfortable with asking these types of questions and how they went about it. And the simulations, they had a few of them, but obviously this was really helpful for their learning, and so they wanted more.
Mm-hmm. Some of the students knew some of their clients a little bit better, and they reflected that the more they knew their clients, the more easy it was to talk about spirituality, and the students that are trying to get to know their clients felt much more barriers in terms of talking about spirituality. So with the lack of evidence of whether students are prepared or not, leaves the gap in knowing how can we find out what works best for students. They found that the assessment tools were a great opportunity. One student said, "I felt competent addressing Indigenous views of spirituality in my practicum with an Indigenous organization. We used the medicine wheel, nature walks, and teachings." And one student said, "I felt more competent, more time, more material, more reflection helped move me forward, but I still feel boxed in when it comes to applying it in practice. I'd really like to put some of this into use."
Yeah, so although this was an introductory course, they're saying, I need more of this, right? Well, the other piece of what we were trying to figure out is how much content could be like in mainstream courses. So we're looking at developing some modules that will go into courses, and then having another course that's more skills-based, so they can get more of this interactive practice type of experience. Do you want to do this one?
Sure. I just like some of these quotes. I have never really thought deeply about my own spirituality up till now, and I was always associating religion with spirituality. Being that I did not grow up within any religious faith, I did not necessarily consider myself a spiritual person. Therefore, gaining the knowledge and insight that spirituality does not have to be tied to a religion was illuminating. And some of the stories like that we hear about that does involve a developmental process from feeling that spirituality is tied to some religious trauma that some students experience growing up, and so separating religion and spirituality was a huge developmental transformation for them, being able to, some of the students for the first time actually feeling like spirituality is, like Lisa Miller would say, part of my birthright and not something that has to forever be stripped away from me because of a religious traumatic upbringing. So there was a whole discussion of that on the discussion boards that I found was really amazing to see that transformation.
And so I've taught this course a couple of years, and what I've really noticed is students start to claim their spirituality. They start to think, okay, what do I want my spirituality to be? And they start to claim it back when they've had religious abuse, or people from 2S LGBTQ populations who have had really difficult spiritual or religious struggles, students who have been in really strong fundamental belief systems, but they're trying to integrate other things that don't fit. How can they make that balance, I guess, as the rabbi talked about. And then also students who are atheists often say, well, I'm not spiritual, but then when they hear about the definition about it, and they start to, and I say, really, spirituality is on a continuum, and we all have some type of way of how we make sense of our life and our existence in this universe, and that is a spiritual task. And so we get the shift of students going, I'm way more spiritual than I thought I was.
Which sort of leads to their reflection on, realizing that they're more spiritual than they thought, and how do they take it from the classroom discussions to their actual practicum, and learning, I thought about how we may show spiritual competence through nonverbal ways, like being present or listening without judgment, but now having a spiritual lens to interpret and reflect on their practice. Okay. So again, one of the biggest things is ethics, right? Like, how do I do this ethically? We talk about non-proselytization, right? So you don't want to be imposing your views on others. That's an ethical piece. We also talk about things, because as a clinician, before I got into this, I was asked questions like, do you believe in God? I was not prepared to how to answer that question. So we have these discussions in class. How are you going to respond if someone asks you that? Or if you are religious and you're engaging in, if you're sexual and that's against your religion, and someone asks you a question about your sexuality that links to your spirituality or religion, how are you going to answer that? And also, how might transference and countertransference happen, and when we get triggered by someone, and how can we have a reflexive stance on that that's spiritually informed, right? And so the ethical piece, really, I think through the course, they were able to really feel better about embracing their spirituality as part of their practice identity in an ethical way, and to be able to bring that into the field. And with the students in Ghana, it was a really big discussion because it was very polar opposites for students in Ghana. In one way, it's extremely strong. Christianity is a huge, strong thing in their social work practice, and a lot of clients want their social worker to pray with them. They can just pray about this issue, and that's kind of like what some clients are really expecting. It comes with like certain types of Christian like guilt and shame around certain aspects of things, so it's very strong, important to have that Christian perspective. And then other students are saying like, that's not what we should do, and we should completely pull away from it. Don't pray with your clients. We have to have a very like scientific stance when it comes to this practice. But what they were talking about is they're understanding that what's the middle ground, and they were trying to grapple with like, how can we ethically have a middle ground when in our cultural practice here.
And so I shared that I was asked by clients to pray. And being someone who may not pray in the same religion that they were in, it caused me distress in the moment, right? And so we have conversations about how are you going to respond? Are you going to say, I'm happy to sit here quietly while you pray? Or are you going to say that actually, is this going to be helpful in our therapy work together? Or are we going to actually say, help me to understand your spirituality and let me pray with you? How are you going to navigate that? So we have these conversations so they can start to think about it before they get in the moment and go, you want me to pray with you? Okay. So, it helps with their ability to navigate that. So some of the pedagogical strategies that I found really helpful in the class, of course, are the interactive experiential things. So doing a spiritual assessment, we talk about interventions. I talk about how do you bring the spiritual strengths from the assessment, right? So are there rituals that they engage in? Are there things that they like? When I was in practice in my later years, I actually started to have like what I called a spiritual altar that had many different types of spiritualities. I had a poster that had all the faiths on it, so that it was like a safe space. People could see that. I had angel cards, I had crystals, I had all kinds of things like that. And people would navigate and say, oh, can we do an angel card? That often became a ritual at the end of a session with clients. So I talk with students about, how can we engage with their spiritual strengths? What are you going to do about the distress that you find out? How are you going to incorporate that into an intervention, or do you need to do a referral? And then also I do a lot of contemplative exercises, mindfulness, and draw on various different worldviews. I do a mandala exercise with them and expose them to that and talk about Carl Jung and his use of mandalas, but also that it's an Eastern practice. We do a lot of classroom discussion, and there's a lot of reflective types of things. They have to do reflective exercises and assignments, and then the role plays. And then also I use David Hodge's tools of using a genogram or an echo map or a life map to help get that spiritual history. And so there's all kinds of really experiential, active, reflective types of activities you can bring into the classroom to support their learning around spirituality. You want me to do this? And so there's sort of this trajectory that this is interesting because this is also in the literature. We found support for this in the literature. We also found it in the evaluation of the class, and I also experienced it as the instructor. So I see this sort of student self-awareness piece coming right at the beginning, this practice of cultural and spiritual humility, and what does that mean, and how do I do that? And then them starting to develop more comfort in having conversations about spirituality. And how do I even say I want to do a spiritual assessment? What's my script going to be, right? And so we talk about different ways of how you can talk to clients, and so they do that, and then they actually start to apply it, right? There's this integration piece, and then they say that now they feel more ready for practice. So it's an interesting.
It's like this. It's also weird.
Yeah. Do you want? You know more about the ARC, or you?
Just split it. We took the same data, but we asked them to just look at how students are reflecting on their own development. So all of their pieces from the data, they're looking specifically at how are they reflecting on their own development, and they found they begin with the barriers that we discussed, and that turns into how Heather described, starting to integrate it in practice, envisioning how they would do so and talking to each other about that. Then they found their spiritual reflexivity deepens, their intentional expression so much more. But they found like a point in time during the course in their discussion post that there was a lot more dissonance and disruption needed to occur, with deeper questioning of how they were incorporating the skills, and then inherited beliefs. So orientation shaped by recognizing where their beliefs were shaped by family and upbringing and religious norms, and grappling with that.
And many students often say, I thought my religion was the only religion, or I thought my belief system was the best belief system. And you get this shift to, I realize there's more than one path. And so this is just very briefly the spiritual competency framework that I've thought about. So I thought, we need to think about the exposure level, right? So that awareness and their role and things like that. Then we need to get into the immersion level, where how do I go about it and apply it? And then in the mastery integration level is how can I demonstrate that I can do a spiritual assessment or a dialogue or integrate it into an intervention. And the domains that we have to, this is like a grid. It's hard to show on here. So the domains are the knowledge and the theories and the concepts and all those things. And then there's the skill piece that they have to develop. And then there's the attitudes, right? Which ties into the spiritual humility and looking at my own feelings and emotions and values and beliefs. And then on the side here are sort of the areas I thought that were important. So they need to know about a spiritual worldview. What is that? And what theoretical foundations support it, and what, theories like transpersonal theory, humanistic existential theory, those are the ones that can support the work. We also really need to dive into that ethical practice. We have to look at our own intra-personal competence and my sense of self. Interpersonal attunement is very important, right? Attuning and reading between the lines, what's being spoken and what's not being spoken, that might be important. And then the professional practice piece of assessment, intervention, and then of course evaluation and looking at research, what's out there. And then I also end with having them develop their own professional development plan in relation to spirituality, and that also includes a spiritual self-care plan.
Which is the digital story.
Yes. So we have a digital story. This is a final assignment from one of the students who went through the class. We're not going to show it all because it's a bit long, but we're going to show you a snippet here.
Just 2 minutes.
I didn't realize how prevalent my religion and spirituality were portrayed throughout my home until I started myself reflecting for this course. I have a lot of spiritual art that I have collected during my travels throughout my life. I am a knowledge seeker and love the past. I find it spiritually uplifting to learn the history and culture of everywhere that I have traveled. This really reflects who I am spiritually, because I am open to try different spiritual tools and interventions from other cultures and religions, and I can learn from my clients in my future practice.
You can see in this the imagery that a student would not be able to put in writing.
I have a lot of books that range from New Age and occult to saints and religious teachings. I have also started a collection of Indigenous ways and spirituality literature, which I know will be very beneficial in my social work practice. In my mind, I believe that Jesus was a philosopher and knowledge seeker, as well as a teacher. Therefore, we should be open-minded to all things that bring inner peace and joy to our soul and make us better people. That is why I was drawn to this course and felt it was so important in the field of social work.
So it's just a little snippet of, you can see that she's realizing her own spirituality, and then also how she can sort of embrace an open spiritual view in her practice. So we have a bunch of these digital stories from participants that we've also sifted through and have evaluated that link to the competency framework as well. So, and I see we're out of time.
Yep. That's everything. Thank you very much.